Welcome, everyone. We are in week 16 of the Ubuntu Symposium. So welcome and thank you for joining us for the session today. I'm going to hand over to Faisal to lead today's session.
Thank you, Bianca. It's wonderful to be here for our third session on the politics of care. And we are joined by our some of the same panelists who've spoken before and a few new faces. I learned from Bianca that you might actually know each other, Rukia and Bianca. So it's nice to see historical connections reconnecting in the session. So today we are going to spend some time in reflecting on the ethic of care that we've been discussing in the previous two sessions. This is the third one of four sessions, and today we are zooming into the care phase titled Giving Care. Let me pass to the panelists to just have a round of introduction, and we can follow the sequence that is on the screen. So firstly, let me say my name is Faisal Vandenberg. I work for, the way I usually introduce myself is that I'm the father of two children, and that's my main job. And in my spare time, I work for 12 hours a day for Sonke Gender Justice on the Men Care Global Fatherhood campaign. And it's really nice to see some Men Care and Men Engage friends in the room. So Asanda, can you please introduce yourself and your position at the organization, and then we can go along with the sequence on this slide.
My name is Asanda Masheng. I work with Oxfam South Africa's media and communications, and my full-time job, as you said, is mother to children.
Thomas?
Hello, everyone. I'm Thomas. My actually full-time job is to be with my son, who is 1 year. I'm on parental leave from January till August. And then I have two older children as well, who are also my workmates. They're 10 and 12. So in September, I will go back to Plan Sweden, working with gender equality and advocacy issues. And I'm also a member of the steering committee for Men Care. Not now, but in September again. Gary.
Hey, good morning, all. Gary Barker. I'm also a partner and a father first, although my daughter is now 23, so she gives me a lot of time off these days. Challenges me in other ways around politics and such, which is fantastic. And then, somewhat in my spare time, lead Promundo's work out of the US, and I'm also been involved in Men Care and working now on the State of the World's Fathers report for 2021.
Hi. Hello. I'm Rukia. I work in Oxfam. I'm the lead on women's economic justice. I hold up the sky for two daughters and many adopted children. So thank you. It's good to be here, and so lovely to see you, Bianca.
Welcome, Rukia. It's nice that you're able to join us today as well. Rukia has also been involved in various capacities in Men Care over the years. So here is an overview of what we will be speaking about. Firstly, we are, I think, joining the revival of the conversation of an ethic of care. I think even before the COVID pandemic, we've seen the conversation about care, at least in the media and in the development sector, re-emerging. And this conversation joins that. Then we will focus more on, in the context of the Men Engage Alliance and the work of the Men Care Global Fatherhood campaign, we will talk about and discuss what does it mean for men, particularly, to be giving care. And we'll be quite specific about what we mean by giving care. And then we will discuss the structural and policy implications of that. I think a theme that's emerging from some of the discussion papers, most recently the one by Alan Gregg, I think, and Michael Flood, but the theme that has emerged through the Ubuntu Symposium is concern about the individual focus of much of the work with men and boys for gender equality, and the fact that the structural work that's required is more political in nature than what we are currently doing. The structural work is not only about I guess, instrumental politics, but it's about really shifting the whole frame of power within which those policies are written. I think that some of you might have seen the recent book by Professor Bob Pease, who is titled Facing Patriarchy, and he makes the point that, progressive laws that are written by white middle-class men are still likely to be biased, even though the laws might be progressive. So let me own that in saying, by speaking as a middle-class white man, I've got a blind spot that I need to manage. So the way these conversations go, and I hope what we want to do today is also that I'm presenting some content from some of the research that I've done, both theoretical and empirical, from a current study that I'm involved in. But then the panel is so resourceful and brings such a rich diversity of data and personal experience that I really want the conversation to not only be about me presenting my research, but also to hear from the whole panel on their engagement with the topic. The book that you see on the screen right now is a publication by the feminist care ethicist and theorist Joan Tronto, written in 1993, and it was really it has become an influential book. I'm using that as a framework for this conversation, and I could really recommend anyone who's interested in the topic to read it as a major milestone in the development of thinking around care and care ethics. She presents a political argument for an ethic of care, and in doing that, she reflects on the work of Carol Gilligan that was done in the early 80s, late 70s, where Carol Gilligan asked a group of girls and women the same questions that had previously been asked by men to other men and boys. And she came up with really interesting findings that women and girls responded differently to the same questions. The previous assumption had been that the answers that the boys and the men gave were representative of all humanity. So not to go too much in detail into Gilligan's work, she also ends with this very strong proposal for an ethic of care as a guiding compass, I guess, for society. Then Tronto made her contribution in the mid-90s, and she highlighted the fact that Gilligan didn't say that women are automatically caregivers, but she just highlighted the fact that as care is associated with women. And then Tronto goes into the history of how that came to be. And now in 2020, in the context of COVID and in this increasing context of caregiving that we are all experiencing at the moment, the Care Manifesto has just been published by the Care Collective. I have not had an opportunity to read this. I just read a review of it, and no surprise that it begins with Tronto's framework as a reference point. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in this topic to really dive into these three books. They are really thought-provoking, and they are certainly not dated, even though the first two might come from the previous millennium. I just heard about the Care Manifesto yesterday as one of the source materials for the current State of the World's Fathers report that we are involved in as Men Care. And Gary will speak a little bit about that a little bit later on. So just briefly, to set a framework for what we are talking about, we are talking about the political nature of care. And a key observation that Joan Tronto made was that through history, there was a separation of public and private life. And that led to a division, firstly, between the public life and morality, whereas previously in pre-industrial settlements, they were usually contained at a village or settlement level, where morality and politics were interwoven with how households interacted. What happened over time is that there were a few separations, and this is the title of her book, Moral Boundaries, where she made the point that, you know, what it means to be good, what it means to be a good woman or a good man, became increasingly gendered and consolidated in terms of, on the one hand, the public, abstract and political life, and then on the other hand, in the private household, particular lived experiences, usually of women and children, and the morality became quite sentimental. And what we've seen as this has progressed over the time that followed is that the public, the abstract, the political, and the profit-focused values are centered. And of course, these are associated with masculinity and manhood. And care as a practice, or particular private and mostly moral experiences, have been marginalized. And this led to a power disparity. So we associate high power with the public decisions, with the abstract decisions, with the political and the profitable, and we associate low power with care as a practice. And if we're talking about centering care, that is the imbalance that we need to correct. So let me, before I go to the panel for a round of input, let me just put up here, we will return to this in a moment, but let me just put up here the 4 phases of an ethic of care that Tronto describes in the book, in Moral Boundaries. The first phase is caring about the one or the object in need of care. And this has a very important dimension of recognizing and paying attention to the fact that someone or something is in need of care. And, you know, some examples are the fact that one doesn't notice that there is a need for care if someone else is doing the care work. The second one is taking care of, and this is associated with taking responsibility for the well-being of another or an object or the environment. And this is often expressed in terms of resources. For men, this echoes a lot the provider stereotype, where we expect fathers to be a good father by taking care of the children. And taking care of is usually grounded in a material lens. So those two, the first two, caring about and taking care of, were the topics of the previous 2 conversations that we had. And today we are talking about the third one, about the very practical giving of care. So let me, and then we'll speak about receiving care in the last seminar in a few weeks' time. So let me pass it to the panel. We are going to, after the panel a reflection, we will ask Gary to just give us a snapshot of what we can expect in the State of the World's Fathers report that's coming out. But before we do that, can I just ask the panel to give a response on the political nature of valuing care? How is valuing care a political act? And Rukia, can I put you on the spot and ask you to go first?
Hi, Faisal. Yes, sure. I'm not going to thank you for putting me on the spot. But, you know, yesterday when we had a bit of a check-in in preparation for today, Vestal said something very interesting, which we often don't think about, right? We don't often think about the link between how we value people, the planet, and what that means in relation to care, and how that builds transformed communities. And so for me, I guess when it comes to the valuing of care as a political act, it's not just looking at individual care, but centering collective care. So what does true well-being mean in the context of our homes, our community, how we depend on one another, how we redistribute and recognize care, which is concepts we often speak about in care. But it's also the recognition, and this is what makes it political, isn't it? It's the recognition that everything, our gender, our race, our class, our different kinds of privilege of some over others plays a role in the impact of care in terms of how we care, how we give care, how we receive care, and how we shift and transform care in all of its manifestations. And so I think it is an apt place to start, to ensure that when we talk about care, we're centering it as political and as personal. So yeah, I think that is Faisal.
Yeah, thanks, Rukia. I'm going to pass to Thomas next, but I really like how you've highlighted the fact that care is so pervasive, Rukia, and it's really ironic that care is so pervasive yet it's invisible. So thanks for that. Thomas, any comment from your side?
Thanks. I think it's more and more political in the sense that the neoliberal world we live in, where that is also, of course, both capitalist and patriarchal, is kind of putting a value to everything. And at least in Sweden, where I live, a lot of privatization has been going on, I think, kind of in the end of neoliberalism as an era, that they try to privatize schools and caregiving, which means it's extremely political, because then that means then that all of these institutions are capitalized. So I think that is good, of course, that we value care as something that has a value, but it might not need to have an economical value as part of an economical system that has the aim of earning money. So I think it's a very interesting discussion about how we value care without valuing it in economical terms, which I think what is happening now, at least in Sweden, where a lot of discussions are going on now with privatization of schools, and children with special needs are not getting these needs because the owners of the school wants to get their profits instead of giving it to the children. So I think it's extremely political, and I think it will be even more in the future when we realize that our societies are not sustainable. So we need to revalue, I think, our entire societies, and then we need to value care much more, but not in an economical way, but rather in other ways than in just money-wise, so to say. So I would say definitely very much a political act, especially for men, because we are also the upholders of patriarchy, especially us, as you said, white middle-class, middle-aged men like Vessel and me. So I think it's an extremely important question, and I agree with that. It's very political.
Thanks, Thomas. And I recognize the dilemma of, how do we value something when our only measurement of value is money at the moment, and that's a real quandary. And I really appreciate the fact that you brought in the services that we receive from the climate and from the natural environment, and the need that, or the recognition that our current lifestyle is not sustainable. Asanda, I'm going to pass to you and then to Gary. So Asanda, any reflection from your side on this piece of the relationship between politics and care?
Yeah, I think it becomes, once you start looking at who is doing unpaid care work and whose care work is recognized and paid for, then it becomes very clear that it is very political, because even when you think about the categorization of care work, that nurses who are mainly women are paid far less than doctors who are mainly men, even though both are involved in a particular kind of care work. It speaks to the politics of care. And I know that at Oxfam, when there was a release of the Time to Care report, for example, there was a costing done up to trillions of dollars, looking at how much money that we were losing basically by not accounting or calculating the care work and the unpaid care work that women in particular we're taking up and carrying on.
Thanks so much, Asanda. And in Toronto's writing, it's something that she picks up on, is this, the position of doctors as a ostensibly caregiving position, but if you actually look closely at what they spend their time doing, it's often positioned more as a manager than as a doctor, especially in the hospital context. And the actual laborious care work. I mean, I don't want to, take on the medical profession, but I do think that there are power disparities even within the caring work that needs to be done. So thanks so much for that, Asanda. Gary, let me pass to you, and for a reflection on this question, and then you can let me know when you want to switch to the slides on the state of the world's fathers, and also maybe just give us a nutshell introduction to what that report is about for those who are not familiar with it.
First, to the question, I think this is the question that we're centering the next State of the World's Fathers report on. But I think thank you, Faisal, for starting off with Carol Gilligan and Joan Tronto and the Care Collective, because I think they do force us to ask and be concrete about where does patriarchy and the gender binary live. And I think Care is so clear that we use these terms, and I think we are a rarefied group that speaks these words, and we think others understand this. But I think this does allow us to say, what do we mean by the gender binary? It means we divide the world into this what is considered masculine, this competitive, individualistic, profit-based production that we give more power, and in fact, the only way we measure currency and worth in the world is monetary. So we say that's worth stuff. And then we've got all the care work that amounts to it is what allows us to be and to thrive and to be human, that we give no monetary value to it. And, so if we want to say, where does patriarchy live? Where does the gender binary live? It sits right there. And I think it allows us to understand patriarchy as a system that puts that masculinist way of being as the thing that holds power, and women and the feminine way of being seen as care as something that is inherently seen as of lesser value. And I think that's the political part. But then the personal part, and why I think it's so important to engage male allyship around this, is that it also separates us as men and women from our interconnected, interdependent, full human selves. We as men lose when we are separated from care. We are separated from that which makes us the most human. And I think this is why, I think Thomas said it very articulate, all of you have, around the important, that if feminism has taught us as men that the personal is political, I think our act of being involved in care as men, I think helps us to have a stake in a feminist future. And I think we often in our male allyship work, and this is what the Ubuntu Symposium is about, we often stick in either, kind of the champion language, right? That kind of, men are doing this, isn't this fantastic? Or we stick at the discourse level where we're doing a lot of virtue signaling about it. But I think doing the hands-on care work helps us as men have a real individual stake in being part of what a feminist, informed, intersectional, connected world is about in our households and for those we care about. But also, I hope that it also connects us as men to seeing our role in the political struggle of the equality that we need, which includes a revolution. And I think the three authors you've cited, Faisal, point toward the radical revolution that we need of putting care first, not profit first. So I think I'm just repeating what all three of you said really articulately before, but just a couple of points where we're trying to enter this year's State of the World's Fathers. Many of you know that Men Care as a group of some 50 plus NGOs that are working on engaging men as equitable partners in care work, turns 10 this year. This is now our fourth State of the World's Fathers report. And we're looking very much at the structure. And certainly we are informed by this COVID moment. And I think many of you know the data that we've seen there, but we're also informed by just how sticky, to call it that, how challenging, how much of a barrier it is to break the binary. Kind of one sobering thought, looking at the data that we have on time use of how women and men spend their time at the current rate of change, where over a 15-year period, men did, on average, we did about 10 minutes more, and women did about 12 minutes less. This speed of change means it would take us 92 years to get to equality, just of thinking about how we spend our time. There's lots of other things to measure and in terms of how we value care work. But just in terms of equality of time at the household and with children and others we care for, at the rate of change that we're at, it's close to 100 years to achieve equality. Ridiculously slow. We're framing this year's report around COVID. COVID has been a care crisis at the political level, at the household level, at the community level. Fantastic reports from Oxfam that I know our colleagues will talk about that have informed us and that we've been fortunate enough to partner with on one of them. Huge amount of burden on care. We know that 60 to 90% of children have been out of school at some points. The burden at home has been tremendous. Studies that UN Women has carried out in 47 countries, 56% of women report doing more care work during COVID, as do 52% of men. But still, the inequality is huge. Women have been more likely on aggregate to be out of paid work, 1.7 times, using some ILO data that's available. It means that their work has been seen as secondary, its income less. At the same time, women have often been the frontline care workers in the health sector and many others, as you alluded to before, Faisal. So the risk, the stress, particularly on women, has been huge, as we know. At the same time, there is something to be seen about, I don't know if I want to call it an opportunity in the crisis, but to talk about the possibility that we could break the binary here. 35% of 80% of women in these same surveys from UN Women say their male partners increased his time in care work during COVID. That's no small thing. That's a huge number of men in the world doing something more. We're not going to declare victory in terms of equality in care work, but I think it is important to say something is shifting. There may be a once in a century opportunity. We certainly have had no other historical moment in the last decades where that many men have changed how much they participate in care work. That's far from equality. The 3 times on average that women spend, and the devaluing of care is still there. But I think we should at the same time acknowledge this shift that might be something we, as a collective, as men engage, as men care, could build on. And the other thing that we'll point out in the report is the lack of thoughtful policies on it. The review that UN Women and UNDP did of policies found 0 that we could find that looked at men's caregiving, and only about 8% of the policies even looked at care work as an issue, even as we're responding to the crisis itself. We're going to come out with structural actions. We're still refining these, and thoughts and comments welcome. I see that Nikki's in the chat room. Nikki Vandenberg is contributing to this, and of course, all of us with Men Care. But we need national care plans. We've got a couple of examples of that, of how to integrate both paid and unpaid care that happens, how to make it a central policy platform with laws and resources behind it. We've got a couple of examples of that in the report. Paid leave, of course, we've talked about before. It needs to be expanded for all caregiving arrangements, same-sex households, multiple caregiving relationships, not just infant children, however important that is. We need to think about how we make equality of men's care work part of social protection policies. Fourth, the issue that, Faisal, you've been bringing up in these sessions of men's personal and political ethic of care. How do we start that early in childhood in terms of how we raise our children? Fifth, how do we think about the public health sector as a place of entry, retooling health sectors to be more human and humane, but also that they can be a place where we make normative men's care. Sixth, how do we tie this to men being activists together with feminist activists around the world who have been working on behalf of domestic workers, informal sector workers? Where is a role, and how can we be meaningfully part of this as male allies? Seventh, how do we get male politicians to pay attention to this? We have to break the binary as well. that somehow women politicians, when they get elected, take care of care issues, and male politicians take care of militaries, for example. We need to figure out how we break those down. So we're trying to look at these structural level actions and really look forward to comments and more engagement of it. Let me stop there because I've taken too much time. But also just want to thank the other co-authors as we're trying to frame this, and we're entering the review process with it. So comments would be fantastic. Thanks, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gary. And I'm just looking at number 5, retooling the public health sector, and one of the reports that Asanda will speak about later about caring for the frontline health workers. And some of the research that Oxfam has done in South Africa really highlights the need to think differently. And just a reminder, I'll mention this a few times during the conversation, but there are two projects here. There's the macro project of recentering an ethic of care in society. And then there is a component of that, which is getting men on board with that project. And we're talking about both of them today. And we're specifically focusing on men's role in engaging in a feminist ethic of care. But we are certainly conscious and contributing towards the broader project, which might not be specifically focused on men, but still has a really important role to play in improving the challenges that unpaid care workers, especially women care workers, face. So while we're hearing about some of the research that's been done, Thomas offered to also share some findings from a recent report in Sweden, from a survey that was done during the pandemic. So, Thomas, I think you just want to speak. You're not showing slides, so we'll just allow you to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Faisal. Thank you, Gary. No slides. Yes, the Swedish organization Men for Gender Equality did a study in the fall with that was presented just in December. That's named Fathers, Pandemic, and Parenting. So they did 1,000 interviews in a survey with 1,000 fathers of children between 0 and 18 years on 5 different topics. And then they presented a short report on that. So the first one was about men's psychological well-being. And the question was, have you felt better or worse psychologically during the corona pandemic compared to how you felt before? And 35% feel less good now. I'm at home with my son full time, so I'm not so used to speaking English for the moment. I'm just speaking baby Swedish, so sorry for my English. Sorry for my English. I'm translating from the Swedish report as well. So 35% of the fathers felt that their psychological well-being was worse than it was before the pandemic. So I think one thing we need to realize is that we also need to give psychosocial support to fathers and men, and that they can be, even though they live in families, they could still be quite lonely. As we know, men have fewer close friends than women, etc. So we need to also think about a more systematized support to these fathers, I think, to help them, as 35% is quite a lot. And only 8% of them has then, in the following up question, felt that they have a need of looking for support, and 16% have said, yes, I have felt a need for support, but I haven't asked for it. So we also know that men have a reluctancy for different reasons to also ask for support when they need it. So I think we also need to see how we can also reach out to these fathers and help them to get the support they need. And 45% of the men have spent more time with their children than before the pandemic, and I think it's a bit lower than the figures Gary gave in the State of the World's Fathers presentation. But I think that's also because Sweden, as one of the most gender equal countries in the world, fathers already spend quite a lot of time with their children. So I think that could explain the lower figure. So, but almost half of the Swedish fathers actually do spend more time with their children. And then they asked if they have been more responsible for taking care of the children. And only 23% said yes to that question. So 75% of the men said that they're not more responsible for the children. And I think this goes back to the question on how to get men more engaged as fathers compared to how it was maybe before the pandemic, and how it will eventually be after the pandemic as well. And then they asked about economy, and 20% of the fathers worried about their economy, which was higher in the lower age bracket, because that's probably when you have a more worse connection to the labor market than if you're an older father. And they asked about frustration, loneliness, and if they felt kind of depressed. And a lot of the fathers, actually 1/3, felt that they had a lot of frustration, loneliness, and moodiness because of the pandemic. And I think the question then is how much gender-based violence and men's violence against women and children will come out of this frustration. And I think that's a global issue with the pandemic, to see how we can try to work as proactively and reactively as well to stop the violence. That is, I think it's a big problem with the pandemic. So that were just some highlights from a study in Sweden about how fathers have been reacting to the pandemic.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Thomas. I think, as we're talking about the politics of care, a debate and a dilemma, I think that we're quite familiar with, at least in Men Care, and I think Men Engage, is how to position men's vulnerabilities within the broader feminist project. Because men's vulnerabilities easily become co-opted as an agenda for men's rights advocates. Sorry, I'm not sure who's calling me. Let me switch that off. There we go. So as I was saying, that thinking about men's vulnerabilities in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health, and as Gary was saying earlier, patriarchy also has deleterious effects on men. I just wanted to point out that the use of the term toxic masculinities is often used in that way, to say that toxic masculinities also impact men badly. But what Professor Michael Flood points out is that obscures the benefits that we enjoy as men from patriarchy. So we also have to note the data point that I have more time than my wife does, and I am more easily accepted into leadership positions than a female colleague would be. So toxic masculinities almost gives us a way to place the bad stuff over there, rather than kind of acknowledging that we are complicit in some way. But I think that in the next session that we will do in a few weeks' time, we will focus on this aspect of an ethic of care that is about receiving care. And I think I would like to actually ask you to prepare to speak about that report again, because we will then look at how do those that men provide care to receive care, but also how men themselves and ourselves, myself, receive care. So on that topic of this engagement of cultivating a feminist ethic of care among men, the first two seminars we had was about caring about, recognizing something, paying attention to it, and noticing that there's a need for care, and taking care of, taking the responsibility in that data point that you mentioned, Thomas, taking the responsibility to take care of one in need of care, or something in need of care. And some examples of how to deepen men's engagement in that. The one example about making the caring about more deepening is just, if our colleague Ilse Smit in the Netherlands often speaks about the work that Rutgers is doing to promote solo care. So to actually have a father, even if they are cohabiting with a partner, alone with the child for 3 or 4 or 5 days. And then you really become aware of the things that you didn't notice before. So you start caring about things that you didn't see before. And then taking care of, we have a huge struggle with financial support of non-custodial children or non-custodial parents, especially fathers supporting the children they do not live with. So there's a massive project to, especially in countries like South Africa, to get men to recognize their financial responsibility for childcare. So that's step one, is deepening those two phases. The second step is to actually expand the range of men's engagement in a feminist ethic of care. And today we are talking about the next one, which is the practical giving of care. And when I say giving care, I'm drawing on Toronto's definition. And I think in our time use surveys and in the empirical data that's collected on care, this is the type of care that we most often speak about. But I do have to point out that caregiving and care work there's a slight nuance there, where caregiving is the physical labor of caring for another or the object of care. It's proximal, in other words, it's close, that the person who is giving the care can touch the person who is receiving the care, whether it's a patient or an elderly person or a child. It's difficult. It is. Our colleagues at Make Mothers Matter say we shouldn't call care a burden, but sometimes it is difficult. It does take work, and especially if it's repetitive. For example, changing the clothes of someone who needs to be changed of their clothes twice a day or 3 times a day. It is hard work. And when it's routine, and then the positive one is the fact that it is life-sustaining. Gary alluded to this earlier, and Toronto also mentioned this, that I pulled this quote out because I find it so powerful, that care work is difficult work, but it is the work that sustains life. It is so devalued in society, but if we do not have care work, none of us would actually be as healthy and as well as we are. So the distinction between caregiving is that very specific practical giving of care, and then care work also can include the emotional labor and the mental labor, the mental management of care work. There was that wonderful cartoon strip a few years ago that was titled "You Should Have Asked," where a mother is cooking on the stove and she's caring for the child and she's welcoming the guests, and the male partner is sitting on the couch, and then the pot overflows on the stove, and she gets really angry about that, and then the man says, "Well, you should have asked." And the whole strip then unpacks the fact that, well, that idea of who's in charge and who's managing the household, that's mental work. And if a man is only doing what his female partner tells him to do, he's he's avoiding the energy of what it takes to think about which clothes the child needs to wear tomorrow. What are in the cupboards for the food that we all have to eat tonight. What's on the shopping list. So anyway, the mental and emotional work is as significant as the physical work. So my reading is that care work is a broader framing, although we most often focus on the practical one. And then before we get to the next panel question, just to say that there are also two quite clear avoidances of care work. The first, or we can call it a men's pass on care work. The first one is the provider pass. And this goes as follows, that I am the breadwinner, therefore I don't need to do care work. So I spend more time earning financial income for the household. So the partnership is equal if you are doing the care work and I am making the money. So that means I can come home and watch Netflix. There's lots of problems with that, of course, and I'll let me not go into some clear examples. I'll maybe leave that for the panel to comment on. And then the second one is the protector pass, which is that I keep my family safe and I play a protective role, and therefore I don't need to do the care work. So I am protecting you. Therefore, you should be grateful that you are safe, and you don't ask me to do anything else. The third one that came up in my own research, which there's also been some writing about, is, I haven't put it up here because I'm not quite sure it's a pass or not, is this whole action of fathers playing with children. In the Men Who Care study that preceded or was launched at the launch of the Men Care campaign in 2011, multi-country study about men in caring professions. Gary was a lead in that, as was Rachel Jukes and Robert Morell and a few others. In that study, it was reported that men often, and in the consequent images studies and lots of other surveys, but it was commented that fathers often revert to playing with the child rather than doing the more laborious, routine work of dressing, feeding, washing, putting to sleep, getting up in the middle of the night. And the question that I have about that is playing with the child, physical play with the child, or creative, imaginative? So I'm not talking about only Xbox or online video gaming, but actually spending time playing with the child. Is that caregiving, and does that provide a pass on care work? So I'm trying to position playing and care against each other, but I'm leaving that as an open question. So we've been together for 45 minutes. I just want to give you an alert that we will go to a round of reflection from the panelists on everything that I've just shared. And after that, we will take a 5-minute break. So if you're getting tired, or if you need to grab a glass of water or get away from your screen for a few minutes, there will be an opportunity to do that in about 5 or 6 minutes. So let me just make that clear. So let me open up for a round of reflection on caregiving, and then I want to add this element that comes from the book as well, which is the competence of care, the ability to actually skillfully provide care. I was sitting in a fathers group, actually in Sweden, Thomas, where a man who was a member of the fathers group said that my wife just instinctively knows how to change a nappy. And he was new to Sweden, so it was actually the rest of the dads were like really surprised that this person mentioned this. But this skill and competence of care is really important, that you actually have the competence to provide the care. So let me just ask for a round of open reflection. And Thomas, maybe with you on your parenting leave, let me start with you to just give some reflection of your personal experience.
Thanks, Faisal. This is my third child, and I remember when my son was born 12 years ago, when we were still at the hospital. I think he had the same diaper for at least 12 hours, because we didn't realize we need to change the diaper. So both me and my partner realized, oh shit, we need to change the diaper. So I think both of us learned that way. And I think that's the thing, as you said, with that representative in the fatherhood group. This is something we learn from our parents and others in our families. And I think to realize that girls are learning this because we are socialized into a binary. So I think one thing is that all of us needs to get the boys to learn this as well. And as men, I think we need to be role models in caregiving for the children. But I think it's a task for all of us to teach these things to the children and youth. And I think also a role for grandmothers and mothers to do that. So I think definitely it's not biological, it's something we learn, but because of our culture, women tend to learn this to the girls, but not to the boys. And I think then playing is a part of caregiving, but I think if you look at everything that is done in a household, women do the routines and the men do the kind of stuff you do seldomly. If you have a lawn, men do the lawn moving, and they take care of the car, but these are like not things that you do every day. So women do all of the maybe boring, or I think quite boring. I'm doing all the laundry now and the cooking and everything, and changing the diapers when I'm on parental leave. And it's not always fun, but otherwise the house will fall apart and everything will fall apart. So I think the routines, we should do the playing, but we should do the routines as well. I think that's extremely important, and also acknowledge that without the routines, everything will fall apart. It's not like it's done by a magic wizard, just zzz, and then it will be there. It's the routines that keeps everything going. And I think we also need to acknowledge that, and also to tell that to anyone who's doing that's like the heavy burden, and playing is the fun part, and that should be done too. But the routines are like the core things of caregiving for me, at least. Yes.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Asanda, I've noticed you've posted a few links, and especially the Care Calculator link recently, but Gary does need to leave. So let me just, Gary, ask you for a closing comment. If you can still hang around, that's great, but just before you leave, to just kind of give a reflection before the hour is out. And then, Asanda, I'd want you to also share your personal reflection and also tell us a little bit about what you've posted in the chat. So before we go to Asanda, Gary, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Faisal. Unfortunately, I do have to leave a couple of things. I couldn't move around. I think how is it that we make, I think, I just wanted to echo what Thomas alluded to, which is, I think, part of the political transformation that helps men appreciate what care means is the doing of it. And I think we've got a huge political challenge as well of how to have men do that without expecting that we get any extra credit or praise for it. How do we, I think some of the conversations become as if virtue signaling a bit that, now I'm doing my part, and now how do we make both men doing it and an appreciation for the fact that we all do it? I think both at the household level, and seeing that our stake in doing it is also part of how we begin to have a more political view of the world that acknowledges our connection with others. And this is where I really see, I think some of the stories of connection, you alluded to our Men Who Care study that we did some years back, that found, men who stepped into caregiving because their life circumstances made them do it more than necessarily they'd come from a political journey. And it was more the having to do it as a hands-on activity that drove them on the political journey, rather than they had kind of an epiphany of, I should do this because of my political awareness. So I think, yes, we want to drive that political cause and want men to be part of it, but to acknowledge this lived experience of doing the care. And I think Thomas said it so well, of appreciating, the difficult part of it. And you said this as well, Faisal, and I know that Asanda will talk about that as well, of no extra credit that men should get when we do this, but acknowledging that it can be a political transformation when individual men do it. And I think the issue is, how do we create circumstances so that our sons and our daughters are doing this equally and seeing it valued and begin to see it as part of their identities and part of how they see themselves in the world? I think that's where there's the really, really transformational power of this. And I appreciate your grounding it in some of the political theorists about how care transforms individuals, but when millions of us do it, it can transform societies. I am so sorry that I have to leave, because I did want to hear the rest of the comments. I'm going to watch the recording afterwards, but thanks, and sorry that I've got to step out.
Thanks for joining us, Gary. Asanda, over to you. So we're doing a round of reflection on caregiving, the competence of giving care, and please, it's open for you to share any of your experience and also the links in the chat.
Yeah, I think I wanted to first share a personal story before we go to some of the links and maybe explaining them. And my story is that when I was pregnant with my first daughter, I had a midwife-led pregnancy, and as a result, the midwife had a session with us post-natally, and which was the first visit that the midwife had after the baby was born. And part of what she did in that session was to teach my husband how to wash our then very tiny infant. And that was very important for me, because it provided, as somebody who was breastfeeding, I was obviously very much bonding with the baby, but that provided a routine and a bonding moment for my husband, while also, obviously relieving me. But what was interesting for me in seeing and observing that and being part of that was then the reactions of society post such actions, and I was just reminded how we keep having instances of individuals who are getting it and are doing the work, but then when they leave the home, society goes back to reinforce messages around who is and who isn't supposed to do what job. And so part of the work that we need to do is, as we are encouraging men to do care work, as we are acknowledging men who, when they do care work, is to sort of keep reminding society that there's no such thing as a man's job and there's no such thing as a woman's job. There's the job that is required for families to thrive and for people to be able to live together in harmony, because we often, categorize and put certain acts of care, acts of service as only for women. And what then happens is that when men do take on those roles, society then questions their masculinity and their manhood in ways that could potentially, depending on your strength of character, take people back. And so there's a sort of back and forth that constantly needs to happen. There's a pull and a push that constantly needs to happen as the work is happening, as we see progress. We have to constantly go back to reinforce to the greater society that doing this work does not make you any less of a man or any less of anything, really. And that's just the personal. And then in terms of the work, what I wanted to share is there's a care calculator that came as part of the Time to Care report that Oxfam had released early last, I think in 2020, where there were calculations done which showed that the unpaid care work that women do is basically worth trillions of dollars, and that goes back to the care work being a political issue. And what was actually done was a campaign around this, which included the care calculator, where you can actually look at how much time are you actually spending on unpaid care work, and think through how that contribution is or isn't even recognized, both in your family structure, but also I think in terms of life in general. And then there's various other reports that have been done, which are pasted quite early on. So if people are interested, they're in the chat. And all of them talk to care work, and some of the work that has been done also talks to health care workers and who cares for healthcare workers. So in the middle of the pandemic, they're exhausted and they're underworked and overpaid. I mean, they're underpaid and overworked and are finding themselves exhausted, but still needing to go home and do even more unpaid care in the midst of the pandemic. And those are some of the issues we need to think about as we think about who is doing what work, and some of the work that the frontline workers are finding themselves having to do even more double duty, both in the workplace and now also in the home. And the inequality in the health system is such that there aren't any institutionally put solutions for women in particular, whether you're talking childcare or you're talking allowances that allow women to have safe that allow women to find in the journey between work and home, and because that's also a lot of care work around keeping your family safe while you are at work doing night duty. And these are some of the major concerns that formed part of that whole campaign around Care for Carers, which I've also put in Care for Carers, which I've put in the link, because that questions who is looking after the people who are caring for everybody else. And I'm sure Rukia can also expand a little bit on some of the work that was done around domestic workers and unpaid care work.
Thanks, Asanda. We'll certainly, when we come back after the break and we move into talking more about the structural implications of this, manifesting an ethic of care, we will certainly look at the findings from the reports that you mentioned and the Care for Carers campaign, Time to Care, the Feminist Futures. So please, it'll be great when we come back to hear in greater detail about those. So let me pass to Rukia. So anything from your side, Rux?
Yeah, thank you, Vessel. I guess mine would be, and I will elaborate on this a lot more when we come back and we start thinking and talking about what some of the structural and systemic shifts are that needs to happen as we think about care. But I think just a personal reflection as well, and it was a session that Vessel, you and I were in. It was many years ago, and we were talking about legacies, and legacies of what we learn, and how what we learn is perpetuated in our lives, and how we and I think the lens was on violence and care ultimately. And there was one experience that stuck with me, and I want to latch onto the concept of play. And someone had reflected on play and how they were beaten up because of that play as a child. And then in their adult life, playing means that you can't do the work. So you're supposed to hang the clothes, fetch the wood, tend the livestock. And so playing takes you away from that, day-to-day chores inside and outside the house. And so particularly for the kinds of work that boys get normed into doing. And so you get beaten up when you play instead of doing those chores. And it stuck with me, really stuck with me, and you reminded me of it now, in that when we even say the word play, doesn't it feel like a luxury anyway? So when we're playing with our children, or whether we're playing as adults in a world that is already so fraught, right? Where play becomes a privilege, a thing of privilege, not a thing of what we do to develop our emotional, psychological beings. And I do think that there's something there. And so it's, how do we unlearn that? How do we unlearn that as adults who care for our children, whether that's a male or a female or a non-binary person caring? And because it's generational, isn't it? The trauma is generational. The learning of what play is privilege is generational, and that can all be reversed. And so that stuck with me, and I do think that again, it circle back to norms, right? In all that we do and all that we manifest. So looking forward to when we come back and begin to talk about some of the structural and systemic shifts that need to happen.
Thanks, Rukia. Thank you so much. I remember that workshop and that moment. So it's nice to be reminded of that. It is a striking example. I would like to ask Bianca to put up a timer for us, and we have about 20 people in the room. So please don't leave the call. Please stay on. And then we'll be back in 5 minutes. You can watch the timer on the screen when it runs out. Please stay with us, and then we'll be back after the break. Please go and have a glass of water, or a cup of coffee, or stretch, or go and play with someone. So we'll see you soon. Welcome back, everyone, and it's really nice to be back in the conversation and in the second half of our discussion on the politics of care, and especially the cultivation of a feminist ethic of care amongst men. I'd like to start this part with a story from my qualitative research. I'm doing a study that's ethnographical documentation of a few families over a few years here in my neighborhood where I live, and around the school that my daughter attends, where I'm looking at men's caregiving practices, and especially trying to select some families where the fathers are very involved in their children's lives. And one of the examples that I thought might be useful to share in terms of caregiving is a man who is not the breadwinner in the household. He is married to his wife, who is she's in a financial services position, and she's quite a high earner. And he's basically positioned as a primary caregiver with his children, and he you know, he comes from quite a traditional background, quite a traditional Afrikaans, which is my language, the background, and which is often quite patriarchal. So it is quite non-conformative for him to be positioned as the primary caregiver of his two sons. And a way that the couple made sense of it, or the way that they explained it to each other, was this phrase that's on the screen, which is that they said, well, since he's not in a typical alpha male position, he's in a beta male position, but it's much better than him being in an alpha male position. So he is now the beta male. So it was really interesting to hear how they had used this play on words to frame his positioning. Of course, it emphasizes, you know, the dilemma that, you know, it needs to be justified in some way or another. But he is playing a primary caregiver role, because they are a middle class family. It's what I also observed in the pandemic. Is that they had a experience that I think many of the middle class families in South Africa had, and especially white families had, where in South Africa we have many women employed as domestic workers. And in fact, if you look at the single profession that employs the most women in South Africa, it is the domestic workers. Rukia knows much more about this field of study than I do, but I think, you know, it's such a precarious position. It's a paid care work position. But in the lockdown, we saw a massive wave of retrenchment of domestic workers for a range of reasons. One of them is that in the first hard lockdown in South Africa, people were not allowed to travel outside of our households except for essential food and necessities. So domestic workers were not able to travel to their places of work. What it meant for this family was that because the mother in the household, the wife, is still doing her financial work online, the father then had to step in and do more domestic work than he had been used to. Even though he's the primary caregiver of the children, he had never done the cooking for the household or the laundry for the household like Thomas is doing at the moment. And I think this raises an interesting point where Gary also mentioned this before the break, that if we want the structural change of gender equality, we need to make the personal work bring the political and the personal closer together for men to make a change at a personal level. So it casts an interesting framework for the critique of the work that MenCare does, which is that we want to see change at a personal level, but we don't only want to see change at a personal level. We also want that to be supported by the structures and the environment that we see around us. So that's where we're going now. Is this session is focused especially on the structural and the policy dimensions to this work of cultivating a feminist ethic of care. And we just received some news last night about some amendments to South African social protection. And I think Asanda and Rukia will be very familiar with these numbers that show certainly a failure of the fiscus, the state financial support for the care in the country. The picture up there is our Minister of Finance, and you can see the banner there that says that 8 billion rand has been given to provincial health departments to fight COVID. The administration and the bureaucracy and the corruption that influenced that was, of course, a major topic. What I wanted to highlight was the amendments to social protection provisions that South Africa offers at the moment. So the first one is a collection of grants that focus on old age support, disability, and care dependency, especially under COVID. And that was increased from 1,860 Rand to 1,890 Rand, a total increase of $2. So this is in the moment when the whole world is in a crisis of care and we need the most support ever for care work. South Africa makes the grand gesture of increasing this by $2. Then focusing on the child support grant, it's even less. The money is less per month, but the increase was also much less. It came to a total of 68 US cents. So less than $1, a total of 10 Rand, from 450 to 460 Rand. So just to put this in perspective for those who are not familiar with the system in South Africa, we're talking here about 7 million caregivers who are dependent on this grant. And that translates to 13 million children who are cared for by those 7 million caregivers. I just got those numbers from the Children's Institute this afternoon when I noticed this discrepancy. And talking about children, the same 10 Rand of an increase for the foster care grant, which also affects millions of households. And for most of these households, this is the only dependable regular income, except for what many households do is informal businesses that are extremely precarious and have been even more challenged in the pandemic. So to add to the context, Asanda, let me pass to you to speak about the reports that you had mentioned briefly before the break. I'll hand over to you for 5 to 10 minutes to speak about the data that Oxfam collected.
Well, I had spoken already, so I think it's Rukia that wanted to expand on some of the domestic worker research that had been done.
Okay, so are you covered, Asanda?
I'm covered, thank you.
Okay, Rukia? You're still on mute, Rukia.
Oh, sorry, Vessel. This time I switched on my screen, but didn't unmute myself.
Yes, I know.
Getting there. Vessel, could you do me a favor? I was actually going to Dr. Google to find out how much 5,000 Rand is in dollars, because I just wanted to go back to, your slide on Social Security. And I know this isn't going to talk to domestic workers, which I can talk about, at length, because it's such important work that we do. But I wanted to just cotton on to what you were reflecting on in terms of the Social Security and many other countries. I don't know who's on this call or this in this session from around the world, but
so 5,000 Rand is $338.
$338.
Yeah, that's 5,000 Rand.
So on average in South Africa, very, very conservative estimate, what a household would need to be able to just survive, not buy sweeties and chocolates and luxury things, and just survive basic household needs, bread, milk, hopefully pay for the children's school fees, not their stationery. You would need about $338, right? That's just to survive. That's like the bread line, the bottom line. And so already Social Security, even, which Vessel rightly says is what we need, what most of our population depends on to survive, is not enough. And in South Africa, Social Security, the child support grant, the disability grant, the pension grant, the whatever grants, social grants that Vessel has just had on the PowerPoint presentation, doesn't go to women and doesn't go to care work, right? It goes to just the basic. And so for me, that's a fundamental, a conversation, a systemic and structural question we do need to have, is that even when we talk about Social Security and Social Security needs, whose needs does it meet? First of all, it doesn't meet enough of our needs, and it certainly doesn't meet the need of women, and it doesn't meet the need of those who care, who give care, who share collectively care, and who does the care work. And so I just wanted to reflect on that a little bit, and then just to say one of the important things that we've been, thinking about around the world really carefully is about. And there seems to be an energy around it right now more than ever because of COVID, because of the COVID crisis, and because our societies are so broken, right? We are incredibly broken, and we're fractured, and we give to capital. All we do with our lives is give to capital, because the economic systems are set up for us to give to capital. And so what does it mean for us to be advocating for even in how we think about calculating of care, because what would be the ceiling when we're calculating care? Like, how much is enough to pay for care? How do we numerate that? And even for our care calculator, it's a problem for me. And I do think it's something we need to unpack as feminists and feminist allies. When we begin to calculate care, how much is enough? And I don't think enough is enough. But the point that I'm trying to make is that one of the ways that we can possibly shift and transform the way we think about economies and people in economies and caregiving in economies is through a universal basic income support that begins to create the space for the working poor, whether those be men or women or non-binary people, that they're able to breathe into what the possibilities are for their lives when they are afforded a hand up. So that's just a reflection, I think, on the parts around social security and the parts around dignity and around dignified work and how we think about equaling the playing field when it comes to care. And sorry, Vessel, that might not, I don't think that was what you wanted me to particularly reflect on.
That's fine. No, but that's really valuable. I really appreciate that you raised that. So for those who, in the chat box earlier on, Asanda posted the link, but the link is on the screen at the moment again. The Care for Carers campaign was based on a report that was done with especially frontline health workers under COVID in South Africa. And it just showed the disparity within the health professions, and especially between private healthcare and public healthcare, and how the broken public healthcare system is even more broken and less able to respond, whereas the private healthcare system is benefiting based on the capitalist values that Rooks has raised. So I would encourage everybody to really go and look at a video. It's 8 minutes. It's really engaging and it's really interesting. And while it's South African, it really highlights principles that are important for thinking about care and frontline health work around the world. Rukia?
Yeah, and I guess one of the reflections which was so profound for me when we were doing the Care for Carers is how healthcare workers were reflecting that here we are providing care, we're doing the caregiving in the times of COVID and the COVID crisis, but who's caring for our children? Who's caring for us? So I'm here, I'm working 24/7. We don't have any canteen facilities. We don't have childhood, we don't have childcare facilities. We don't even get extra pay for the work that we do. And that was, I think, one of the telling findings of the Care for Carers is the inhumane working hours that healthcare workers in South Africa and around the world have been subjected to in the caregiving that they do. And that, right. I think it is interesting. It's a short video, Vessels, right? And worth the watch for your policy work.
Thanks, Rukia. And I think, we've mentioned these throughout the seminar, but let me just say them slowly so people know if you're interested in reading on this. The one paper is called the Feminist Futures paper, and it sketches a pathway towards reinvigorating an ethic of care around the world. The other one is the Time to Care report. And then the second one is this report, the Right to Dignified Healthcare Worker, Right to Dignified Health for All, based on the Care for Carers campaign and study. From the State of the World's Fathers, but also from some of the main care countries and suggestions, there are three policies that I wanted to highlight in addition to the universal basic income grant that Rukia mentioned, which currently is being advocated for. The stalwart women's rights organization in South Africa is called the Black Sash, and I think Oxfam and Sonke, a few others, are supporting the work to advocate for a basic income grant in South Africa. In addition to that, a major important step for us would be to see subsidized quality early childhood care. The ECD sector in South Africa still depends on parents being able to pay school fees, mostly to informal early childhood development centers. And South Africa has opened the stimulus package for ECD centers now in the context of the pandemic, but the administration and the access to that are woefully inadequate. Secondly, for those who are familiar with MenCare would be very familiar with our work to advocate for equal paid parental leave. We just heard yesterday that Spain has actually achieved equal leave for parents, which is a major step forward. The argument that we've built on for years is that leave for fathers creates an equal playing field for mothers, to use the binary in that sense. But, to step beyond the binary, equal leave for all parents removes a particular discrimination of women and non-binary people. So parental leave is another key measure for seeing equality, especially in the caregiving that we are talking about today. And then the example of Uruguay's national care policy has come up recently, and in South Africa, we're now very focused on the National Strategic Plan to End Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. But as a proactive, positive investment in care, a national care policy is a very useful framework to propose and to think about. And not only as a operational measure to actually set a plan in place with resources behind it to achieve more equal care, but also just to make it, so as Gary says, the normative piece, to make it understood that care is important enough to deserve a national focused policy. So that's really exciting developments. Rukia, you added this slide to the presentation, and it is about data and budgeting. So if you could speak to these 2 points, please.
I'm so keen. Thanks, Faisal. Thank you. And I'm so keen to hear what others have to say. It's my pet peeve right now, the gender data gap. And how not, because so many would say, but there is a lot of gender data. What are you talking about? There's a lot. But I guess it's about how that data is analyzed and how that data makes its way into how we plan. And then to add that there isn't enough gender data. And I think that's one of the important places for us to start is that gender data gap. And how we use it in the design, because it's one of those places, right, where the gendered inequality, the labor market inequality, the care inequality lives. It sits right there. And I wanted to take just like a small step back and then just say everything that we're talking about right now, we're talking about in the context of economic models that are neoliberal, right? That doesn't meet the need of both men and women, poor working class men and women. It doesn't meet the need. So we are saying, and even I'm reflecting on this myself. I'm sharing these possibilities of structural interventions to shift how we think about care and how we think about social reproduction. But I'm sharing it in a context of where what we ultimately really should be doing is campaigning really hard for a shift in economic models. What are the alternative economic models that would mean that when we collect gender disaggregated data, that it is used in ways that can be analyzed to meet systemic and structural needs of all. So for example, Thomas, one of the examples that is made is of just where the gender data gap is so present is in Sweden, when they were doing analysis of at what time should they be plowing the roads for snow in Sweden, and they weren't, they were like, okay, people are moving to work at 6 a.m. in the morning. We should be plowing the roads at 6 a.m. so cars can move. But no one had thought about, but what time do women walk their babies in the carriers to daycare on the sidewalks? Not in the streets going, driving a car off to wherever your place of work is, but the women who walk the streets trying to get their babies to childcare, and the pavements aren't plowed, and the pavement is covered in snow, and wetsuit and the babies are, women are falling. And so there's one example of where there's data, but the data is not gendered. And so you're not thinking about how to clean pavements so that women can walk. Another example, which women could relate to, right? The queues in toilets, always long, right? Where are the baby care facilities? In the women's toilet, right? So the women's toilet queue is always long. The changing the diaper happens in the women's toilet, not in the men's toilet, but the men's toilet is there's never any queues because biologically, physically, logically, I take longer to pee than men do. But our toilets are always 2 cubicles for women, 2 cubicles for men, but when men don't really need the 2 cubicles. And so, there's many of those examples of how we design, how we think about infrastructure, how we think about needs and care that is biased, that is, gender blind. And I thought that that's an important one, for us to reflect on. And I'm so keen to hear the thoughts of everyone on the call in relation to that. And then the other one, most of you know and advocate for probably, which is linked to the gender data gaps, is gender accountable and just budgeting and planning. And I think especially at the local government level for us, where we really need to be thinking about what we talk about through the lens of care. And so how do we redistribute? How do we recognize, our art? But then how do we redistribute to infrastructure? And that infrastructure needs to happen. So, at local government level. And I think that's where the planning is amiss. There's a lot of work we're doing right now with local government municipalities to think about how they can strengthen their, gender accountable budgeting at that level, specifically around infrastructure that lessens the responsibility of care for women and for households. And I really just wanted to put, to present that as potential systemic things we need to be mobilizing for. Thank you, Vessel.
Thanks, Rukia. That's really useful. And I noticed that Nikki had posted a link to a book about the gender data gap. And Nikki, I'd like to actually, after Thomas has spoken, if I know you're caring for your grandson, but if it'd be great if you can join the discussion when we open up in a moment. But Thomas, just talking about the gender data gap and the kind of blindness to a gender interpretation of especially financial support, you had mentioned in our preparation something about a sex-specific or a gender-specific or a taxation that was quite innovative in your context. So can you tell us about that?
Thanks, Vessel. Just on this shoveling of snow that you mentioned, we had snow, but it melted away last week. But I think it's kind of, there's a risk of it being symbolic, because we are now constructing a highway in Stockholm for, I think, $10 billion, which is a huge amount of money, so that men then can drive their cars. And also they construct a tunnel underneath the cost of the king. But in the suburbs where the poor people live, the car will be going underground, which means the poor people will be polluted, but the king will not. So I think it's a risk also of this being a very symbolic politics. And this, the shoveling of the pavements, of course, is great, but there we could also shift in total and abandon driving cars, or at least not building new highways for them. So I think I agree with what you said, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that it shouldn't just be symbolic, this politics. Yes, I think what you asked me to talk about was the primacy of work, I think, because in Sweden in the 70s we had a lot of we had very little unemployment because our economy was booming. So we needed women to get onto the labor market, which means that we started with the universal childcare and also eventually parental leave. And also that before that we had married couples had taxation together. So it meant that if a man had a job, the woman, there was no need for her to work because her salary would go to taxes anyway. But then they split it up in the 70s as well. for women to be individually taxated, and I think that's important too. Apart from the primacy work, if we want gender equality and of course women's economical empowerment, I think we have to have individual taxation, and I think that was another part of the puzzle in Sweden when we started these reforms in the 1970s to also have individual taxation apart from childcare and parental leave. But I think also we have to acknowledge that this was done by our social democrat government because they had the primacy of work. I don't know the English word for that, but that work, the paid job is the most important thing, and there was no unemployment. Women needed to go out on the labor market, so to say, and I think that's great. But also we need to acknowledge, I think, when we talk about caregiving, that caregiving should have a value as well. And it's like I found some statistics from Sweden, for example, if women's sick leave doubles when they have children compared to before they have children, for example. So I think also. So I think also we need to acknowledge that we need to value care, and it has, as I said in the introduction, it has to be valued in other ways than in the economical terms. And as you said also, Rukia, before, that the neoliberalist world is kind of everything should be about economics, and I think that's a developing discussion and as well. And I posted a link in the chat from the Degrowth Network, which has a feminist degrowth working group working on caregiving. So I think also there's more and more acknowledging also about when we think about nature's rights, we talk about human rights, but nature's rights as well, that men's dominance over not only women and children, but also over nature. And I think connected to climate change and environmental degradation, etc., that we need to restructure our entire societies, and then we need to revalue care. And I think devalue going to a workplace in your car in the morning, and that's not what we value. But that is still very much the value, even in Sweden, still being kind of the most gender equal country in the world. So I think there are a lot of foods for thought on these issues, but I think definitely we need to value care much more than we do, but maybe not always in financial terms.
Exactly. Thanks so much, Thomas. And just talking about the link to, I guess, patriarchy and the effect of patriarchy on the climate and men's participation in improving climate care and climate justice. So the ethic of justice applied to the climate, but also the ethic of care applied to the climate. There is another session on the same symposium a few hours after this one. So please go to the MENengage link and the program and see our colleagues Vidar and a few others are doing a very interesting session. This is also the second session in a series, and we are also participating in that later on. Just in what you were saying, Thomas, a word that has come up quite a bit for me when I think about this is the word appreciation. And appreciation has two meanings. On the one hand, it means that you are grateful for something, that you say, I appreciate the care that you are giving me. But then there is also the meaning of appreciation, that something appreciates in value. And a question that's come up for me quite often is, well, not the question, but the phrasing is, the goal of an ethic of care is to have care appreciate in value, because it currently has a low value in society. And we're putting a massive investment in care, so therefore we need to see that investment appreciate. So it's not only about care appreciating, but it's about the appreciation of care, or the way care appreciates. I think you get what I mean. It's unfortunate that meaning does come from the economic framework, but I do think the message comes across that we want to see the value of that increase. So this is basically the end of our presentation, and I'm really happy that we have about 20 minutes left for an open discussion. I have my little dad's group camel with me. Some of you might have held this camel in your hands, actually, in some of the conversations we've had. So I can't pass the camel to you through the screen, but it's the familiar caring camel. But let me open up for just any questions that any of the friends in the room have for any of us, or any comments that a panelist or anyone who's with us together wants to make. I would like to ask Nikki, while your grandson is sleeping, to maybe it would have been great to have you as a panelist on the call itself, actually, Nikki, but maybe next time we'll see if we can plan for that. But Nikki, is there anything that you would want to contribute? I think you might be on mute, or maybe the grandson woke up.
She's writing in the chat that she can't unmute.
So sorry, Tamilan, if you could just
it's working now.
There we go.
I couldn't unmute.
There we go. Now can we hear you?
Yeah, I'll try and put my video on too. Thank you, Vessel, and thank you all. Such an interesting discussion. Yes, I could talk for a very long time, but maybe just 2 or 3 points. I think he's stirring on my little camera, my little one. But yeah, I mean, I think the first point I want to make is that whole. Rukia, you really showing the kind of structural and the individual, that when we talk about care, we think about it in very narrow ways, and actually it relates to all areas of our lives. You're talking about living wages, we're talking about gender data gaps. There's so much there that's included. And I still always go back to some of the kind of early feminist economists who've been working on this for 20 years, and particularly Diane Elson's framing around recognizing, which I guess is better what you're talking about, appreciating and valuing care, and then reducing it and redistributing it. And that framework still works so well when we're thinking about care. And when I was trying to write the blog that I've put up in the chat box, I was trying to look at newer framings around care from feminists that have come up during the pandemic. And Vessel, you showed the Care Collective book, which I think is fantastic. In the UK, the Women's Budget Group is a very small organisation, but has kind of had a number of people they've called commissioners who've gone around the country and talked to people, and they have come up with a very comprehensive analysis of what it means to have a caring economy, which is really interesting. And similarly, there's various feminist groups around the world who are looking at the politics of care. The Feminist Alliance for Rights that's done a feminist analysis of care. So I feel as though we're beginning to get those blueprints. They don't always include under the redistribution bit about men's involvement, and I think that's something Ubuntu and Then Care has been providing and continue to provide. But I think that the whole piece about the business of care needs to be everybody's business. It's going back to what Gary was saying at the beginning, is beginning to be something that's recognized in theory, because everybody's been caring in the pandemic, but not what we can actually do about it. And I think that's the piece that we now need to think about. And your framing there with that early work with Jonto and Gilligan, I think Vessel is really helpful in that way, in terms of thinking of the different kinds of care and what we mean. But until we value it, then nothing's going to change. And it doesn't have to be always an economic value, but sometimes that's helpful. There was I tweeted something yesterday from China, the first time that a Chinese husband has been forced to pay his wife when they divorced for the housework that she did. It was a ridiculously small amount, but I thought that was quite interesting, that even in China they're kind of thinking about, well, what does that mean and what is it worth? But how do we do that from a feminist perspective and with a grounding on gender equality is I guess the next big question. I could talk for ages, but I shall stop now. I want to hear what everybody else has to say. But thank you for this. It was really good.
Thank you, Nikki. So it's open for anyone to join. You're all welcome.
I could add on solo care unless someone else wants. I've already spoken, but so I won't steal time from anyone else. But
I was going to ask Mpho to join us in a moment, but Mpho, maybe you're not prepared. I know you're also caring for your children while you are listening to this. So Mpho, maybe do what you need to be able to speak with us in a few moments if you'd like to. But Thomas, over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to add about solo care. I think it's an excellent word. And in Sweden, our system makes it that you do solo care because we have very nuclear family settings. We don't live with extended families. We don't have caretakers and maids, etc. That I know is the case for at least the middle and upper classes in South Africa. So I think also to acknowledge that by doing solo care, you understand how much work caregiving is. And I think that's something we also need to acknowledge. I think in the pandemic, it's also easy to see that when we're most people in the middle class setting again works from home, and then that's also I think a case that women get a double burden of doing their job and caregiving for their children, etc. at home when they are working from home as well. So I think also to be able to make a good setting from the start, I think men need to do solo care with their children to understand the workload of doing, as I said, the laundry and the cooking, etc. And also, of course, continue with that when the children are getting bigger. It's not like you do it when you're in parental leave and then you end when you go back to work. It's something that you should continue doing. But I think a lot of men, they didn't do it before, but hopefully they do it when they're in parental leave. And of course, it should continue. But I think it's important to do the solo care to be able to understand how much work it is to be on parental leave. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
I think, yeah, Asanda mentioned in our preparation session that, this is very much going to the first phase of care in caring about recognizing, paying attention to care, in Nikki's language of the Oxfam, the 3 R's, recognizing care. It's a visceral recognition, it's a bodily thing that when you do it, one of the fathers said that during the pandemic, when he was doing the domestic work, he didn't notice that the laundry basin is too far from the washing machine, and he actually could move it quite easily, but the domestic worker and him didn't have a relationship where she could mention that to him, and she just dealt with that. But or the washing line was too low and actually made his back quite sore. So he noticed those things that he didn't know about, even though he was quite willing to change them. So it is this thing of a very practical engagement. Our friend Vidar from Men for Gender Equality always says that the minimum should be 4 days for a father to be alone with the children, because over a weekend you can get away with takeaways and not washing clothes and maybe not bathing, but after 3 or 4 days you need to start cleaning clothes and you need to start eating a bit more healthy. So 4 days is kind of the minimum recommended session to actually start to take real responsibility for the caregiving. Mpo, you're very welcome. Colleagues, Mpo, or friends, Mpo is Mpokushli Mabena is our co-coordinator for the Men-Care Global Campaign, and I'm not sure if that's Nolotando or Nokulunga, but welcome. You and your child are welcome.
Oh my gosh! It's like a reunion here.
Yes, it is. I think Bianca will open your mute in a moment.
Yes, sorry, just Tamizan, if you could undo the mute for Mpo.
There we go.
Thank you, Bianca. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Faisal. Thank you for giving me the time to reflect a bit. I'm sorry, I'm having my children around, and I think that's why these discussions are quite important, because they become so real, not only to the general public, but even to us as individuals. I think for me, something that was quite profound was Gary's reflection on how we may take about 94 or 92 years to reach gender equality. For me, it was a huge shock, such that even my daughters now, they may not see that happening in their lifetime. So we really need to do a lot of work, and especially in involving men in the care work. I was actually sharing with a colleague on the call right now a picture that I took just before the session started. I had Nobulunga on my back, and I wish I could have shared the picture with you just to see how, working from home and work has really doubled the amount of work that women are doing at the moment. So for me, when we have these discussions, they also come back to me to say like, okay, I'm walking the path. So I'm really glad that we are having this discussion so that even though it may sound a bit abstract to say we are talking these things and not really going through the process, but we are. Even how Thomas was mentioning his journey also of his first child, not knowing what to do with the nappy. I think these are discussions that we really need to put out there for everyone to hear and really learn a lot from us. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mpho. You know what you're reminding me about is that what we're seeing is, who is that? Is that Noluthando or Nukulunga?
This is Nobulunga.
Okay.
And this is Nobukosi.
Nobukosi, that's right. Hi, Nobukosi.
Hi.
Hi. You're very welcome. Were we talking about something? What were we talking about? I can't remember. So everyone, it's been really fantastic to have this time together with you. We still have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask Thomas, Rukia, Asanda, and I almost said Gary to please just give us a closing comment. If I see a hand, I'm happy to pass to anyone who still wants to ask a question or have a clarification. But I think it's time we bring this plane into land. So Asanda, let's start with you, just for a closing reflection.
Yeah, thank you. I just, as you're talking, I actually just was thinking about how to connect an earlier comment that you made and something that I think Rukia had said around, you said that men often have the excuse that they don't have to do care work because they are taking care of the home. And Rukia was talking about the gender and the gender pay gap. And I was thinking about, some of the ways in which patriarchy just doubles and triples itself and replicates itself in our homes. Because if you think about the fact that there's a gender wage gap, even if a woman is working, ultimately she's likely to make less money than a man. And therefore, by definition, the man will earn more. And if we follow this logic, this illogical logic of I'm taking care of the family financially, then ultimately women will always be more indebted and more expected to do unpaid care work, because systematically we are placed, even when we are in the same roles as men, exact same roles, we get paid less. And so I just wanted to bring that up as a thing that sometimes, even in these seemingly flippant utterances like I am doing the hard work of working for the family, there's a lack of recognition even in that statement of the hard work of potentially being in a workplace where you're not getting paid the same amount, but B, the unpaid labor and the amount of time that it takes for you to be able to do the work. And I think also just thinking, whether you're talking from an academic, as an academic or any other perspective, we often take for granted how the work, the unpaid labor of women actually makes men successful in the workplace. And I think that's why we're seeing more and more innovation in terms of when divorces happen, that people say, well, you stayed at home while I made the money, whereas actually the person who facilitated the making of the money is often the woman, because she's making sure the kids are taken care of. She's making sure that the home is run so that you can go off and do what you need to do. And we see this when we look at, for example, the discrepancies between the publishing rates of men and women. Men publish at a much higher rate than women because men have the space to think. They have the time to think, and society affords them that time. And there isn't, a space in the X number of authors that allows for you to put your wife, who was making the tea, who was making the food, who was doing the things that were making sure that this, breed genius or brainiac that you are is producing this output. And it's very interesting when, like, for example, as a female academic, it's always a very interesting thing for me to see the ways in which my male colleagues are supported in those ways by their wives, in the ways in which as a woman I don't necessarily get the same, and yet the promotion cycles of a system and an institution like academia expects the same level of output. And even to take it even further, if you think about the care work that female academics are expected to do of students, for example, that the female academics will listen to the cries of students, will have more space to talk about the things that are happening in the students' personal lives, while the men continue with the work and therefore end up getting the promotions. So I just wanted to mention that, because we spent a bit of time talking about the personal and you know, the political, but I wanted to talk about it sort of in a very work-focused space, in the ways in which patriarchy just continues to just replicate itself in every piece of your life. As you try to escape it at home, you're ending up in another space getting it, and you're running away, and you're ending up, you know, in another space. And that's why these conversations are so important, because if we don't challenge men on their role of caring, we don't challenge men on their understanding of roles, then we really are going to have broken, overburdened women who are generally unable to do work that is important, which is participating in the rearing of the next generation, and just generally also just living their own lives outside of parenting and everything else in between.
Thank you so much, Asanda. I couldn't agree more. A few words, Thomas, in closing.
Thanks. I found this quote today, and I think it's quite important. There is no going back to normal, because normal was the problem. And I think we need to acknowledge that with the pandemic, that all these programs of going back tend to think that we should go back to normal. But I think normal was the problem. And actually the word economy means administration of the household. So economy is the admin of the household. So I think to acknowledge now that this is also a possibility for us to form societies that value care, and the feminist ethic of care that societies did not do before the pandemic. But I see also a risk that very many people and people with power wants to go back to how it was before. But I think we should push by these kind of conversations to the new normal being something different. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Rukia, in the remaining 90 seconds.
Okay, 90 seconds going. I think my final reflection really is that, you know, it's what I'm going to circle back to how we started, and when we started talking about true well-being and resisting the dehumanization of others, the dehumanization of women. And I want to reach out and say to all of us, you know, let's work extra hard on collective resilience. If we're going to survive this COVID and the next iteration of the COVID pandemics to come, we are going to have to get better and think more about our collective resilience. And then, because Thomas ended with a quote, I'm also going to end with a quote, because he inspired me now. And it's not necessarily related to care, it's just related to, you know what, we should also cut ourselves some slack. So it is, adulting is soup and I'm a fork. You get that? Adulting is soup and I'm a fork. Wonderful. You know, so let's just, you know, I'm going to pop it in there and I'll figure out who said it, but it's stuck with me.
Thank you so much, Rukia.
Thank you.
Colleagues, I am finished, and this is the end of the session. Before I hand over to Bianca for a few words, and please go out there and give care.